This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk. My guest on this episode is North Dakota Superintendent Kirsten Baesler. Now, we've all been living through the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been not very fun. And one of the not very fun parts of it is the impact that it's had on our schools. Now, how schools have handled the pandemic has varied a bit from place to place. Obviously, our communities are very different. And for a lot of excellent reasons, our local school officials have a lot of latitude when it comes to implementing policies. So some schools have not closed. Some schools have had, sort of a hybrid model where they're in class and they're not in class. There's been a lot of stuff, but all of this sort of unusual, let's just say it hasn't been business as usual. And because it hasn't been business as usual, that has had a measurable impact on the academic progress of our kids. And now we may need to do something about that. Here to talk with me about that is, like I said, Superintendent Baesler. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Rob.
First of all, I mean, obviously we know what the problem is. Kids haven't been in classroom. They're getting their normal instruction the way we'd like them to. So can you before we start talking about some of the things, and I know your office has been working with teachers and other stakeholders to develop some solutions to this. But first of all, let's talk about the scope of the problem.
Sure.
Can you give me some numbers? I mean, how are we measuring this? How do we know that the kids aren't doing great?
So absolutely, I can do that. So, maybe I'll just, back up to March of 2020, that, infamous day on March 15th when the governor announced that we would be closing schools buildings indefinitely and giving the teachers, March 15th, giving teachers and schools a few days to regroup, assess what's going on in their community, make a plan for distance learning, and then later that week announcing that school buildings would be closed indefinitely, but he expected that all learning resume in every school district by April 1st in order for schools to continue to receive their foundation aid payments from the state. So as they did that, when we did that in April, North Dakota was one of the very first states in the nation to require that the learning continue. Others followed somewhat in some shape or form, but not to the extent that North Dakota did. Governor Burgum was very clear that if they wanted to receive their foundation aid payments from their state, their per pupil payment formula, that they must continue their learning through the end of the year to the best of their ability. And they must submit plans that were reviewed by the Department of Public Instruction and approved by his office eventually. By April 1st, our students were back learning again. I think that more and more people in North Dakota are becoming aware of how different that was compared to some of the family, friends, and relatives across the nation. Some states simply shut down buildings and shut down learning for the spring semester. So we slowly opened up. I had a soft reopening in June, and then in the middle of July, we provided guidance for our school districts to make local decisions about how they would open. If they would open in a distance learning model, a hybrid model, or a face-to-face learning model. One of the things that we were able to do immediately, part of that guidance was a requirement that within the first month of school, that every student, kindergarten through 12th grade, would be assessed. So our schools knew exactly where each and every one of our students stood in their journey of learning and what skills needed to be retaught, what skills needed to be introduced for the first time. Another thing that we did was we were able to stand up very quickly an identification of what the learning models, how many of our students were enrolled in each learning model, hybrid, distance, or face-to-face. And we've had nightly feeds into our Insights dashboard, our insights.nd.gov dashboard, since early fall. Here's where we're at today as far as the learning status. As of last week, We have 451 school buildings in the state of North Dakota. As of last week, 409 school buildings were predominantly face-to-face learning model. 30 were hybrid, and 12 were still predominantly distance learning model. We expect that those 12 will go face-to-face during the month of March at the very latest. So that's where we're at with our learning model. But I think to the point of this conversation and what do we need to do, during that time, whether it's been face-to-face, hybrid, or distance, the disruption and for lack of a better word, a bit of chaos and chaotic delivery has ultimately had an impact on the learning of our students. And we sometimes use the word learning loss, and it's something that we don't really like to use because when we use those words learning loss, it sends an immediate message to our students, our families, and our teachers that have been working so hard that they've done something wrong, that they lost something.
Yeah.
And so we've chosen to use the word accelerate the learning recovery. So we don't want to.
Before we get into that, I want one thing I want to make clear is that it's not just my school was hybrid, my school was face to face the whole time. There's been disruption even beyond that because, and I saw it in my family. I got sick in December with COVID. I ended up in the hospital for 11 days. My middle schooler had it, so she was out. So, and then it kind of made its way through our whole household. And between the time that we were actually sick, plus the time that we had to, by state and school district rules, had to quarantine because we were in close contact with people who were sick, my middle schooler ended up being out of class almost the entire month. She had a bunch of makeup work to do at home, but because we were sick, we weren't on top of her as much as we should. Her grades suffered. And a lot of that's because she wasn't in the classroom. So even though our class was face-to-face, and if she had been healthy or not needing to quarantine, she could have gone every day. She didn't because we couldn't, and that had an impact.
Exactly. And as you've described your family, we've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families, and some of those families are teachers, and some of those families are teacher spouses. And so, as I said, nothing has been normal since March 13th of 2020 in K-12 education. That's just a fact that we all, whether we like it or not, you can only improve and get better when you admit that there is a challenge and you need to start working on that. And so that's where we're at. And as we talk about learning loss and just the chaotic delivery and the kind of the chaos, again, through no one's fault. Teachers, administrators, families, students themselves, they are just heroes in all of this. They have forged their way through with resiliency in a way that I'm not sure any of us, even expected we could do, but we have. But there's also something, when you talk about learning loss, that assumes that you've learned it, right? And so we have summer reading loss. It's something that they were taught in the spring, and then they kind of lose their proficiency or their skill over the summer. And that's true with anything. That's true with academic knowledge. It's true with athletic skill. It's true with anything. When you don't spend time doing it, you lose some of that skill. But we're also talking, Rob, about you can't lose something that you were never taught. And so there are some things that we simply didn't get to this spring, that we didn't get an opportunity to teach our 5th graders or our 8th graders or our 11th graders. That's not learning loss. That's a learning opportunity that has to be revisited, that we need to make sure that we incorporate that into the next year.
So how are we measuring whether it's learning loss, whether it's because they missed time and maybe they got back or they just never were exposed to the material to begin with? How are we measuring this and how are we doing?
So what we did this fall, we required that everybody be assessed. There is one state assessment, not a state assessment. There is one interim assessment, a formative assessment that is used by multiple of school districts in the state. It's called the Northwest Education Assessment, NWEA, sometimes referred to as MAP tests in our schools. So we have access to that on a statewide level. So we compared 2019 fall NWEA MAP tests to fall 2020. What we saw was those students that were on grade level in the fall of 2019, between 25 and 28% of our students that were on grade level in the fall of 2019 were not performing on grade level the fall of 2020. The gap was wider. The decline was deeper in our students that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, our students of color, and our students with special needs, especially. So on average, we were anywhere about 25 to 28% lower. Our teachers have said, everybody was still getting used to things. They were learning and teaching in new ways. They felt that they were going to do better this winter. Dr. Ellie Shockley will be running an analysis of our winter assessment for NWEA. We'll compare winter of 2020 with the winter of 2021 exams and have that information available. So that's how we're measuring, and it's about the only statewide data that we have available to us. Local school districts, because they own their own students' data, have access to data that we don't at the state level. They have access to kindergarten, first and second grade assessments that we don't have access to. They have access, they may use the STAR Renaissance or an ACT type of measurement. So local school districts, we hope and we've heard, are using that data to measure within their schools. But statewide, we figure we're between 25 and 28% of students, fewer students proficient than they were last year.
So that's not good. Now I guess
No.
let's get into what do we do about it? And I know you were just in front of the legislative committee, talking about a report that your office has with some proposals that I think in some ways maybe tough medicine. Because we're hearing some things like longer school year. A lot of parents don't like to hear that. We're hearing some stuff about, special tutoring. What are some of our options here?
So it was interesting. The very first week I was in front of and you'll appreciate this, I was in front of the Education and Environment Appropriations Subcommittee. And appropriators don't often talk about other things other than dollars and cents and balancing our North Dakota state budget, which is what their role is. The first day that I was in testifying, presenting DPI's budget, we didn't talk much about dollars and cents. We talked a great deal about what is the plan. There was a great deal of grave concern by the appropriators in that subcommittee that North Dakota had a plan. They were basing their comments and their questions on their own experiences, whether it be their grandchildren or their children who were in school or their children who were teachers, spouses, all sorts of, they had great concern. And they gave me a very clear directive as a state superintendent that before we got to crossover, I was to have developed a plan that they could consider to ensure that North Dakota was going to be a state that was accelerating its learning recovery and that we wouldn't be facing the impact of this pandemic through student performance who eventually become adults for the next 2 decades. And as we talk about how do we know if it's learning loss or if it's something they never learned, math is the perfect example. There are things that you learn in 3rd grade math that you really never use again until 7th grade math, but it's critically important that you have mastered that 3rd grade multiplication, double-digit multiplication concept so you can be successful in 8th grade and or freshman algebra. And so the compounding impact is what they were trying to prevent. So they gave me this directive. I know from my experience that it's never a good idea for an idea to solely come out of the Capitol or the legislature. So knowing that the best ideas actually need to come from, and best decisions need to come from those people that are actually implementing the ideas and the interventions that we're proposing. So the teachers, the principals, the family, the special education teachers, the school superintendents. And so we brought together those people to take a look at the ideas that our team had put together. So again, the team at the department, we took a look at what other states were doing, what other countries were doing, countries that had opened up their school systems before, that had the pandemic hit them, and now they are in the process of accelerating their learning recovery. So the DPI team, they gathered all of that information, they analyzed it, they identified which ones had the best research-based results, and which one of those would fit best with North Dakota's not only culture, but also our geography and our tradition of K-12 education. And they narrowed it down to 19 ideas. We met for 4 hours with that stakeholder group. We facilitated conversations, and those practitioners, those teachers, went through each of the ideas one by one, and they identified the benefits of that specific approach, the challenges of that specific approach, and how the funding could be used if they would decide to pursue and embrace that approach. A couple of general themes arose from their feedback. The themes from our stakeholders were they had concerns about legislators requiring a one-size-fits-all approach, legislating a one-size-fits-all approach. They had concerns about requirements and mandates. While they welcomed options and opportunities and welcomed the ideas coming from the state capitol, they did not want anything to be required or mandated. Many commented that many of these things are already occurring in their school because schools do what is best for kids. They had concerns about staffing issues. If a legislature would require certain things, would they be able to recruit the teachers and or staff necessary to implement the ideas? Overall, really, the stakeholders representing the large school districts expressed a strong aversion to any new regulations and wanted local control to be applied to every topic. They really don't want any new regulations put into place, and said school districts are often expected to find money in the budget in the future after ESSER funds go away, and that's sometimes a very big challenge. They felt that they were heard and appreciated how the department had organized the feedback process. So at the exit, before they could leave the facilitation, it was about a 4-hour facilitation conversation, their exit ticket, if you will, were to select and identify the top 5 proposed ideas that they believed would make the most impact to accelerate learning recovery. And the number one choice was high impact tutoring. Most agreed that high impact tutoring would have the biggest impact. And when we talk about high impact tutoring, we talk about things that for kindergarten, first and second graders, 1 or 2 students with a teacher. Maybe they occur in after school time. Maybe they occur, in this summer when the kids are just getting done with swimming lessons and we send a tutor or a teacher to the local community center, the local swimming pool to spend an hour this summer with these 1 or 2 students one-on-one. The second biggest, or the second most selected idea was social, emotional, and behavioral interventions. Right after that was school calendar adjustments, things such as providing some tutoring during holiday breaks or extending the school year this year, starting earlier next year, providing a shorter Christmas break, doing a camp adventure during the summer. So essentially, we prioritized those ideas. 2 ideas that the legislators picked up on today were embraced by our stakeholder group. One of them was to create a school health technician credential, and the other was to create the requirement that elementary schools have a school counselor, 1 FTE, 1 full-time equivalent school counselor for every 300 students. So those were 2 that they discussed this morning. I'll be back in front of the subcommittee tomorrow morning at 8, and I anticipate that I will be back on Monday morning to further discuss some of the ideas.
What's a school health technician?
So that is a new idea.
Is that like a school nurse?
So it is. So it's a step between a layperson and a school nurse. And so you've been around, the legislature. You've understood that. Boy, actually, this is a little trivia. The very first issue that I ever testified in the legislature on as a mom, as a PTA president, if you will, was advocating for school nurse funding for our schools. So that was way back in the early 1990s, and here we are today. But nurses in general are really, really in short supply, especially in our rural communities. So to be a school nurse, you have to have an RN. What the idea of a school health technician is, I would work with the state health officer to identify training components of areas that most impact or present themselves most frequently in our K-12 system, such things as juvenile diabetes, asthma, sometimes anaphylactic shock reaction, head lice that's been around forever, social emotional trauma, those types of
Yeah.
things. So the things that are most present in our schools, identify those, work with the state health officer, develop a training program, and then what this would do is give me the authority to issue a credential. If a person that might be, they might be a phlebotomist, they're not even an LPN. They might be an LPN, but they're a phlebotomist. They graduated from, Dakota, college up in Bottineau, and they live in Cavalier. And if they're willing to go through the necessary training, they could be credentialed as a school health technician, be hired by the school for a certain number of hours, and be that bridge, if you will, between the K-12 system and the public health system.
And some medical expertise that's more addressing the health side of things. How do we keep kids healthy in schools? How do we address if we have, well, obviously we're not out of the current situation yet, although things are looking better. But in terms of the academic, I mean, some of the things I'm hearing you talk about, I mean, high impact tutoring, social what was it? Social behavioral intervention, I think you said.
Social, emotional, and behavioral intervention.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And then adjusting the school calendar. I mean, on one hand, I think when you hear that anywhere roughly a quarter, I think the numbers you said were 25 to 28% of our students not performing on grade level. You hear that, boy, that doesn't sound good. On the other hand, you start hearing, well, maybe we'll hold a summer camp for kids. Maybe we'll have this high impact tutoring. That's not going to be cheap, right? I mean, those are going to be some pretty significantly costly initiatives if it comes to that.
That's correct. So I'm not sure if you're aware. This could probably be a whole other 30-minute podcast, but the Appropriations Committee has spent a considerable amount of time understanding the relief packages that have come from Congress. So as you know, the CARES Fund was approved in March of 2020, and North Dakota received $33 million. So North Dakota K-12 education received $33 million. And it was appropriated in a way that I delivered that out to our local school districts on the Title I funding formula basis. So we received that, DPI received that in April. We delivered that out to our schools by May of 2020. The most recent round, CRISA, which is the second relief package, K-12 education in North Dakota received $127 million, I believe, $127 million. So $33 million in April, $127 million in December, and we're anticipating from what I've heard is being considered the $1.9 trillion package that's being considered in D.C. right now. That would deliver over $400 million to K-12 education in North Dakota.
Is there an idea that something like this would be like a long-term thing, or are we more looking at, hey, it's something that we're going to do until we get the numbers back on track?
Well, I think that's where our legislature, particularly our appropriators, they know that this, almost a $500 million has come to K-12 education in North Dakota, or will with this third round. Everybody is worried about how are we going to sustain that. I think our legislators, and I can't speak for them, but from the sense that I've gotten from the Appropriations Subcommittee is that we need to spend this money now to get our students to where they need to be so they graduate choice ready. And then, when they come back in 2023 or 2025, they'll see where we're at. Yeah. And if there's still a need for additional funding, we'll have to make that decision then. But at this point, right now, we have to solve the immediate problems first.
I think there's going to be some concern that if we start doing some of these things, there's going to be some desire to handle some more staff, especially some of these initiatives about, school counselors in elementary schools, the school health technicians. There's some feeling like we're going to create some positions, and then the federal funding goes away, and then how do we pay that going forward? Well, that's either going to be state dollars or that's going to fall on local dollars. Property taxes, and we all know how North Dakotans feel about property taxes.
Right.
So,
Right.
I mean, I think I mean, there's a problem here, obviously, that needs to be solved or needs to be addressed or mitigated in some way. And yet I think there's also maybe a feeling that we don't want to do a permanent thing that's going to be with us forever.
Well, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And you've probably heard me use the analogy before, is that sometimes we need to do things in K-12 education that looks like Red Cross intervention. And so this is an opportunity. We have a bit of a crisis in K-12 learning right now. So what we do in normal times, normally an entity doesn't come in and supply blankets and cots and water to the locales. But when there's a crisis and there's an emergency, you come in, you provide those supports, but those supports don't need to stay after the crisis has been mitigated. And so I would encourage us to look at it like this. So these 19 proposals, while each local school district is going to need to look at them and to say, what level of crisis are we in here? What do we need to mitigate? But we need to turn this around or else it will be compounding. And then take a look in 2 years, 3 years, and say, do we still need the same level of supports for this generation of students that we needed for those few years? And if not, then you start to make some different choices of spending.
How likely is it that we're going to see changes to the school calendar?
I think that each school district will actually make some changes to their school calendar. And I'm not going to say that they will make changes and an ultimate, like a mandatory, compulsory attendance, but I think that you'll see changes to the calendar where they will make teachers more available to students, or they may reduce some class sizes for, a summer term. I think you'll see more school districts offering some summer camps, some Saturday tutoring sessions, some after-school programming that might not have been available. So I don't know that you're going to have year-round school or a 10-month school, but I do think we're going to see some tweaking around the edges of our school calendar.
Well, that's going to be interesting. There's a full report. I'll try to post a link to it with the podcast. But your office has a full report out on all these recommendations, or I guess possibilities or proposals, or I don't know what word to use. I'm scrambling. But Kirsten, I appreciate you making time for me, and it's going to be interesting to see how this goes forward. Because again, there's a real problem to solve. But I like hearing that we're probably not going to get a one-size-fits-all solution from the legislature. Maybe more just some funding, hopefully to enable locals to implement what they feel is needed. Because I mean, let's face it, some schools in North Dakota never stopped doing face-to-face classrooms, right, and other places did. So, it's the need isn't uniform across the state. That's for sure. Exactly.
And we've never been a real fan of one-size-fits-all approach, and I'm not a fan of it. What's working for my hometown in Flasher, North Dakota, is not going to be the same solution that Minot needs or Fargo needs.
Kirsten, thanks for your time.
Thank you.